Hi folks, my name is David. I'm the minister here at Erskine Parish Church. It's great to have you connecting with us, and I'm so glad you found our online resources. If you were to come into our physical church, you would get one of these welcome packs, so consider this your digital welcome. However you've joined us, we'd love it if you could like and subscribe to our platform. That allows you to continue to see when we're putting up new content. And also, if you'd like to get in touch and actually connect with us, you can email at epcnotices@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. Titled the message this morning, The Lord and His People. And it's a common human experience to try and find your people. Sometimes we try with varying degrees of success to find our people somewhere we fit in and belong. A lot of us go through this in perhaps formative years, such as through high school. That was my experience. I had a kind of group of friends that I came up with through primary, and most of what bonded us was football. And then the ones who were better at football managed to consolidate their social status, and that was definitely not me. And I struggled more and more to feel like I fit in. And then by that point, I was starting to kind of hang around with other musicians because I'd started to play guitar and be in bands and so on. And I kind of found my people there. It was through starting to then hang out with people who were practicing in bands after school. And in fact, when I was up in Lewis at New Year there, I was spending time with one of my oldest best pals who I was in my first ever band with. And so there's a real power to finding your people, and it solidifies you and it gives you a sense of grounding for life. And a lot of what we're considering here in John's opening prologue is him threading through all the different pictures and parts of the Bible where God is looking to be with his people in a really permanent way. And of course, the great irony at the center of it is that Jesus came to be with really what should have been on paper his own people, and that's not where he found the fit. So I want to look at a few things. I want to look at specifically the actions of God within this passage and what that means for us, because we find that God has made everything. He says that the world was made through him, and that even though that was the case, Jesus, as he comes to the world, is rejected. And then Jesus, nevertheless, though, he makes a people. He creates a new people. The people of God, who aren't who we'd expect them to be. And then what he does is he dwells among and in the very middle of that people. And then he gives gifts to those people, the grace and truth of God. So I just want to take those things in turn. We're basically just going to rattle through the text almost line by line or phrase by phrase. But my points are all shorter than they usually are. So rest assured. Verse 10, he was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. We've just had Christmas and Advent, and we've celebrated the beauty of incarnation, what it is for God to come, even though he is God and dwells in splendor in the light of heaven, to come to our earth as a helpless infant and baby, and then to live a very ordinary life. And when we zoom right out to the story that the Bible gives us, we see that was not accidental, because the phrase John uses, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. He says that the Word is the agent that made creation, and he likens that to Jesus. You remember how God created the world? And nobody in John's original audience would have been mystified by the language he uses, because they would have been immediately thinking of Genesis chapter 1, where God said, let there be light, or God said, let dry land appear in the seas, and he separated them, and so on. But it was all done by the power of God's word, by a kind of speaking agency on God's behalf. And John kind of fills in. You know how you give your children colouring books and they've got the lines, and what they need to do is try and fill in the bits that are missing. John fills in the bits and says that Jesus, whom you know and who I'm writing about, he was the one through whom the world was made. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, he was the Word, the one who God spoke through in order to create everything. And so the irony of that is that all of the world and all of the creation, in a real sense, belonged to Jesus. There was no part of it in its splendor and majesty as God made it that Jesus didn't have a claim on or even a relationship to. And so he made everything. And when you consider that, and you consider the material details of God coming to be amongst us, and the birth, and the manger, and the novum and the inn, all of that is quite profound when you think that he made everything that made those material circumstances possible. But not just did Jesus have a claim on the world broadly and in the largest sense, and that's maybe a bit abstract, the idea of God creating absolutely everything. But he also brought a specific people into relationship with him. Though he was in the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. So the kind of the potter doesn't recognize the craftsman who has made it. But then it's kind of more agonizing than that. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. His own people didn't receive him. Do you remember we thought about this in the Exodus narratives, that once God redeemed the children of Israel from slavery, and he sets them free from that which is weighing them down in life and as a people, he does that as an act of grace, and then he makes this really special kind of promise to them. He says that out of all the peoples of the earth, that I've chosen you and I've set you apart. You shall be my people and I shall be your God, in Deuteronomy chapter 7. And that bond or covenant is repeated so often through the Old Testament. And so you would think then, as those that have the inheritance of the creation stories of the law and the prophets, they've got all of this, and so Jesus comes to them as God's agent, as God's representative, as the one who is there to finally show them what the Lord is like, and they reject him. Sometimes this is given as they just didn't recognize him. You know the story that's been popularized in a million different ways of the king and the beggar. There's the story of the king who wants to know what the people in his kingdom look like, so he takes on the cloak of a beggar and he finds out lots of horrible things about himself and what people think, and so he changes his ways. And there's various different versions of that story, but that's one. But it rests on the premise that nobody recognizes him. This was even more painful because Jesus came to the people not only whom he'd created, but whom he'd given the gifts of his word and his law and his ways, and even of relationship with him and through the Father. And none of them recognize it. And not only that, they willfully reject him. Because he honors his word, he comes to them first and says, because I've made this bond or covenant with you, and we have centuries of history together, and I've chosen you, and I've decided to be faithful to you, I will come, or God specifically says, I will send you my son, the one who is the word, the final communication of what God is like. And not only did they not recognize him, but he came to that which was his own, and they did not receive him. And a lot of what John speaks about here continues to be relevant and a possibility in our world and in our experience, because you see, there are two different things. It's possible to not recognize the work of God or Jesus in our midst. I know there's been times in my life where it's only retrospectively I can look back and I can see that God was at work in a situation or answering prayer or in my life. So not recognizing God is one thing, but there's something more acutely painful in what Jesus does, in that he gives his own people the opportunity to reject him and to reject the truth that he comes to bring them about who God is. And they do that. And I've tried to think so many times why God has chosen to do it this way, because it doesn't make an awful lot of rational sense on the face of it. We are used to thinking of God or gods as powerful, as majestic, as showing a lot of the prowess that perhaps the rich and the successful do in our world. And God doesn't do any of that. He comes, and he comes almost for a hiding. He comes to be rejected by his own people who he's shown love and faithfulness to. And I think there's at least one applicable reason for you and I that I can think that he does that. And it's so that he can relate to you and me. Because you and I often know what it is to face rejection, to face unmerited criticism, to face questioning of our motives, to go into a situation where we have goodwill towards, whether it's people in our family or people we want to work with or people we're in a group or organization with, and we want nothing but the best for them and to help contribute to it and build them up. And they question everything that we're doing, and they might ostracize us and kind of set us out and leave us out in the cold, or they might outright reject us. And there's no rational reason for them to do that, but there are a lot of human motivational reasons. Because you see, sometimes people struggle with goodness. Do you find that? It's easier just to push it away because they don't know what to do with it, or because sometimes the goodness can act as a mirror and can flash up some things that people are not particularly comfortable with in and of themselves. But that doesn't take away the pain of your rejection in that moment. And so some of you might have been through that recently, and Jesus would want to say to you that he knows exactly what you've been through because he specifically chose to come and experience that himself. But the question for some of us is, what do we do with Jesus? Because it's as possible for us as it was for the original audience of John to reject him. Because he comes with a message, comes with a demanding message to take up our cross and follow him. He comes with myriad blessings. He comes with the call to deny ourselves in humility, to realize that we cannot be the captain of our own destiny, and we actually need God, and we need to throw ourselves upon him and look to him for mercy, for forgiveness of sins. And for some, that's the greatest stumbling block, and that's the point at which they check out and they reject Jesus. So what will you and I do with Jesus, particularly looking to another year? Will we be like the original audience and his own people who rejected him? Because God will honor our choice. He came to his own, and his own did not receive him. But he still makes a people. This is not the end of the story. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, children born not of natural descent, but born of God. You see, God's plan of redemption, of grace, is unassailable. And that's what we find all through the story of the Bible. And so it doesn't matter how many times, if you read through the Old Testament, it is a cataclysm of people continually, especially God's people, continually rejecting him and walking off the path and forgetting about him and wishing that he didn't exist or that they could worship some other God. And even though this has happened, when Jesus finally came, that did not stop God making a people. So what God does is he supernaturally births a people through his grace. He gives them this gift. The phrase "not born of human origin" is really interesting because nearly every natural birth has some kind of human agency, and there's planned versus unplanned and all of that. And the text kind of hints at that there's always kind of humans involved. And it's only in being made the children of God that it's got absolutely nothing to do with any human, in a sense, including ourselves. This is the wonder of grace, is that God comes and deposits grace within our hearts as a gift that has very little to do with us. And that's good news for those of us that we think we need to drum up effort in order to attain God's grace. The only thing, as I'm often fond of saying, that is required is that we believe in Jesus' name. And to believe in someone's name in the text of Scripture in the ancient world was to believe in the person's identity and the entirety of the message behind their identity and their name. And for Jesus, that was that he has come as the perfect image and representation of the invisible God that we are searching for. And to believe in that, and that that's who he is, that's how we inherit and become heirs of the right to be called children of God. And the irony is that once we do believe that, and we accept that, we realize, oh, it was God that actually made me one of his children and has been working and stirring away in my heart for a long, long time before I even got to the point of saying, yes, I believe that's Jesus, and yes, that's the one that I need and whose message I believe in. So despite his rejection, he made a people. He continues to make a people. And maybe for some of you out there today, that is the last missing step, is in order to be a child of God, wondering what you have to do. It is to those who believe in his name, he gives the right to become children of God. It's so simple and yet so profound that it's very easy to go past it. It's simply to believe in Jesus and the message and his identity, and that he has been sent of God to save his people from their sins. And then what he did, having made a people, is he dwelt amongst us. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. There's a sermon in every one of these verses, so I need to keep it short. The Word became flesh. I was thinking about that a bit this week, and then the relationship between that and him dwelling amongst us. We think about that at Christmas. This is the incarnation. This is God taking on human heart form, not becoming any less God, not diminishing his glory or who he was, but if you like, which is the Christmas hymn that talks about veiled in flesh. He comes in glory and appears. Which one is it? Hark the herald angels sing. It's not. We can fight about it after. There's that's a lovely sentiment that sums up exactly what God does in the incarnation, because he doesn't put his glory anywhere other than carry it into our world in a way that we would always miss it. This is a bit more like the beggar and the king story, because if you think of a powerful king coming and in order to fit in with the lowest in the society, taking on the rags, that's what Jesus does. He clothes himself in what is the lowest estate possible in our world, particularly in the time into which he comes. He comes into a part of the world that has no military or political power and is simply the vassal state of another much more powerful empire. All of that timed and delivered perfectly to show the kind of king he is and the kind of ruler that he is. Because think about it. God could have, none of this has to happen the way it did. Think of the power and the majesty of God, and think of the fact that he had a desire to become clothed in flesh and become like one of you and me with a full human nature. He could have still done that and ruled in the most glorious of human circumstances. Or he could have done that and ruled from a great distance and only come intermittently, and not really ever lived a full day of the kind of life that you and I experience, which is often burdensome, troublesome. It is plagued by suffering that we don't always have an answer to. It's in contact and in human relationships that are sometimes difficult, frustrating, or hurtful. He came and he dwelt amongst us in the flesh and experienced all of that. But this is the important thing. The word that John uses for dwelt amongst us is, another good translation is he tabernacled, because he's lifting a word from the Old Testament. Remember what the Old Testament tabernacle was for? It was so that the glory and the presence of God could go with the people of God wherever they went. So it was a tent with poles, with specific instructions. And to the outside, it would have looked fairly ordinary, because it was designed to be put up and put down and carried through the wilderness with ease. But when it was up, God would dwell in the very center of it, in the most innermost of its courts. And his burning glory and presence was so great that only the high priest was able to go in and to make intercession there. There was a kind of unapproachableness about it. Very ordinary looking on the outside, very glorious and awesome and terrible in the truest sense of the word in the inside. And that's kind of what John's getting at here. He made his dwelling amongst us. We've seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. And here's the mystery and the power of who Jesus is. He comes in the most ordinary circumstances. And if you would have seen him at the time, you'd have probably thought he looked pretty ordinary. There's a prophecy about him in Isaiah says there's no comeliness about him, that we would desire him. So he doesn't come with kind of celebrity model looks. He certainly doesn't come with the wealth. So everything is ordinary. But if you discover what is within him for yourself, you realize that within him is nothing but the glory of God. And that's why it's easy for so many people to pass by Jesus and to find nothing interesting in him or about him. But to those who do discover it, he's the most precious thing that they've ever encountered, because they realize he's the one who's showing me what God is really like. He is the one who's come to communicate to me that God is compassionate to me, that he's gracious and that he forgives my sins. He's the one who's come to give me the meaning and the purpose in my life that God has always designed that we would have, or that I would have, but that I've been skirting around and perhaps even running away from. And now I've found it. And I've found acceptance with God, and I've actually found some healing and acceptance within myself. Do you see? All of that becomes glorious to someone who sees what is really within Jesus Christ. And so he made a people, and then he dwelt amongst them, not being content to have the glory of God housed far away, but that it might burn within a group of people who were called God's people. And then lastly and finally, he gives us God's grace and truth. He came from the Father full of grace and truth. For the law was given, verse 17, through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ, and he gave us grace upon grace. I think John's doing some wordplay with grace and truth, because there's a really lovely phrase in the Old Testament where God would describe himself and his nature and character, where he would say that he was a God of kindness and faithfulness, of that he abounded in steadfast love and mercy. And they're kind of similar terms that are kind of used a lot, and they speak of a couple of ideas. One is that God is kindly disposed towards us, despite what our own hearts may tell us, or even what sometimes the church would tell us. But secondly, that God is faithful, which is a different idea. It means that he's dependable or true, in the sense that geometrically things can be true. He doesn't change in that sense, and so what he's shown himself to be like to you, he's not going to... How many of you have encountered somebody who's volatile and unstable, and you don't know what you're going to wake up to and what they're going to be like that day? So it's the opposite of that. That's what God has come to show us that he's like through Jesus. That's the truth, or the trueness, or the truthfulness of God. And so you put these things together, and that's what God has shown himself to be like to us, and will continue to be like to us, because if he cannot change that, then this is as dependable for us as it was for John. John says we, the same God that the evangelist encountered in Jesus, the same one you and I encounter, who were able to benefit from his grace, the fact that he's come to gladly wash away our sins and give himself freely to us and connect us back to God, but also the fact that then in his dependability, he's not going to reverse that, ever. So whatever you and I are facing in the year ahead, most important thing is that we know the grace of God, that he's loved us and forgiven us. But secondly, that we know his dependability, that because of his truthfulness to who he is, his integrity in his word, that Jesus will never leave us or forsake us, and that he's actually able to bear us up and carry us through whatever we face, because nobody can ever take the grace of God away from us, him giving us his love and his forgiveness, and nobody can ever make him change his mind about us, that he will be faithful and true to us. Those are just some of the things that Jesus has done for us and encourages us to depend on as we move into a new year. May God bless his word to us. Amen.